First of all, some of the statistics that I'll be giving do relate to the whole of the UK and not just England, but primarily the presentation is about the progress of the church in England, going right through from 1837 through to modern day. And the little map that you see will appear on quite a few of the screens, and little dots will keep appearing on it to see where the gospel's being preached. Here we go back to the well-known date of 19th of July, 1837, when the first missionaries arrived in Liverpool with the Apostle Heber C. Kimball and Apostle Orson Hyde, and along with Elder Willard Richards, Elder Joseph Fielding, Elder John Goodson, Elder Isaac Russell, and Elder John Snyder. So there we go, setting foot on the shores of the UK, 1837. And very quickly, they travelled up to Preston. And the reason, of course, why they travelled to Preston was because of the brother of Joseph Fielding. And we'll go to that story in a minute. The distance is 31 miles, which they travelled by horse and coach. So they took up lodgings on the 22nd of July at St. Wilford Street, which is part of the church history tour, as most of us realise. And this is where the two of the brethren there, Isaac Russell and Elder Kimball, had that rather horrifying experience of meeting with the evil spirits, which we're not going to go into this evening. That's a story to be told by itself, I'm sure. But straight after that experience with the evil spirits, it was decided to get away from that property as soon as they can, and within a few days they found a new place to go to. But before we go to that, going on chronological wise, the next thing that happened on the 23rd of July, that's just the following day, there was a meeting to be held in the Vauxhall Chapel. Now, Vauxhall Chapel stood between two roads and facing onto Vauxhall Road. And what had happened, immediately upon arrival in Preston, Joseph Fielding sought out his brother to see if his brother would be able to help him find a place for them to preach. And of course, his brother James said, well, yeah, you can come and preach in my chapel, means he was a minister of another religion. And this chapel, of course, was the Vauxhall Chapel. Now, Elder Kimball wrote in his diary the following: "It being noised abroad that some elders from America were going to preach, a large concourse of people assembled to hear us. I called their attention to the first principles of the gospel and told them something of the nature of the work which the Lord had commenced on earth. After which Brother Hyde bore testimony, which was received by many. And many were pricked in their hearts and began to praise God and rejoiced exceedingly." Now, straight away, you could imagine James Fielding, the minister whose chapel this was thinking, well, hang on a second, they're not quite praising my church here, they're praising someone else's principles. But at this point then, that made Vauxhall Chapel, it made it that it was the first site of the first formal preaching of the restored gospel outside of North America. So that's quite an achievement there. And they spoke again on the same evening and on the following Wednesday. And by this time, the Reverend Fielding, as we'll call him, was getting rather agitated. And when he realised that several of his members were looking towards getting baptised, he banned them from further preaching in the gospel, and unfortunately became quite an antagonist against the restoration of the gospel. But at least it gave the kickstart to the church here in England. 30th of July, going down to the River Ribble. And here we have the first 9 people being baptized. That was George Watt, George Miller, Thomas Walmsley, Anne Elizabeth Walmsley, Miles Hodgson, Henry Billsbury, Mary Ann Brown, Ann Dawson, and George Waite. And what I find rather incredible, we've got 8,000 people turning up to watch this spectacle. And it makes you wonder why so many would have come. And I think we wonder that because we just think of our own experiences in the day in which we live. And that is that not so many people's interested in religion these days. But back then, there was the great revival still underway. And many people were taken up into different religions or different denominations. So it was quite an interesting thing to see baptism by immersion, which at that time only the Baptists were performing. So on the afternoon of the 30th of July, the same day these baptisms took place, Isaac Russell preached to an assembly of about 5,000 of those people at the obelisk in Preston, and many of whom were pricked to the heart, as the journal recordings tell us. And by the 6th of August, so that's just a week later, there'd been nearly 50 baptisms taking place. Now then, I mentioned they had to get out of St. Wilfrid Street residence, and they moved into Pole Street. Now I've shaded in roughly where I think the house would have been that they moved into. Just a terraced house, although when you look at them on the Ordnance Survey map, those 2 or 3 houses in that particular part of the terrace had extensions to the back and were slightly larger than some of the others. They were built in the 1820s and pulled down in the 1960s. Now, this was the home of Ann Dawson, who was running a lodging house, and she was one of those first 9 people to be baptized. She was a widow at this point, so I guess she had to be the main breadwinner for the home. And here in this property on the 6th of August was the first official meeting of members of the church. So all those that are being baptized, or many of them, not sure if they all were there, joined together to hold their first official meeting. So yeah, 28 people were confirmed on that day, and the first branch in the Great Britain there was organized, which, as you'll know, that makes that particular branch the oldest continuously running branch of the church in the world. On just jumping forward a little bit, and then I'm going to go back, but whilst we're talking about Pole Street, on Tuesday the 14th of April 1840, so we're nearly 3 years in advance, the quorum of the 12 apostles, or at least 9 of them, assembled in this particular home, and that meant that was the first time that such a meeting, in other words, a meeting of the quorum of the 12, had been held outside of the United States. And it is here where Brigham Young was sustained as the standing president of the quorum. And just as a little aside, Anne's daughter, whose home this was, Anne's daughter Alice, she was the first person as a member of the church to pass away, and she died on the 2nd of September 1838. Now then, since they were ejected, should we say, out of the Vauxhall Chapel, a new place had to be found, and it took a couple of weeks to find a new place. In the meantime, they'd been preaching in the outdoors, but the new place that they secured was the cockpit, also known as the Temperance Hall, and they moved in there in September of 1837. So it was agreed that they could hire the cockpit for as long as they needed it, and therefore that means that this became the first established place for public indoor preaching. We won't, let's say established, we won't count Vauxhall Chapel because that was only for a few days. So the cockpit was literally what it sounds made out to be. It was a former cockpit, and you can imagine that the building was constructed to accommodate cockfighting and not necessarily for the preaching of the gospel. But one or two interesting things took place here, and that is at a meeting on the 8th of October 1837, the first branch had grown so big that it was now divided into 5 separate branches. Noticing this is just within about 10 weeks. 5 branches were now created. And on Christmas Day of 1837, the elders held the first conference of the church in Britain. So that's pulling all the 5 branches together. And there, the word of wisdom at this particular conference was introduced for the first time. Now, I wonder how many people today, if they was told about the word of wisdom several weeks after being baptized, I wonder what it would do for them today. But maybe it was the same then. Maybe some turned away from the church. I don't know. Going forward a few more weeks onto the 7th of March, 1838, they had an 8-hour long conference with 700 people in attendance. So 700 people fitting into a hall, which should have a maximum have held 600. But nevertheless, they all got crammed into there. Going forward, just 4 more weeks, they had another conference on the 8th of April, and that one lasted 12 hours. But that didn't include a couple of breaks. And then 2 weeks later, on the 15th of April, saw the first conference in Britain to be presided, sorry, not 2 weeks later, 2 years later, 1840, which is when the Quorum of the 12 came, and had that meeting in Pole Street, and then they presided over the conference. That's the first time that the Quorum of the 12 had presided over conference outside of the States. And by this point then, so this is April 1840, that's less than 3 years that the church had been in the country, it was reported that there were now 34 branches of the church with 1,677 members. Wow. And it's at this conference that the Millennial Star was announced, and the following day, Parley P. Pratt was appointed as the first editor. It was also announced that the church needed a patriarch. And within a matter of days, Peter Melling was chosen and ordained by Brigham Young on the 17th of April, 1840, becoming the first English-born patriarch and living in this country. He was a local convert and had joined early in 1837, but he didn't stay long. He emigrated in October 41 to be with the saints in America. Now then, let's have a look at the little further expansion. I mentioned we've got 34 branches. So where were those branches being organized? So on Monday, the 31st of July, 1837, back in time again, so we're very early, still in the first couple of weeks, missionaries were assigned to Elder Richards and Goodson to Bedford, where some of Elder Fielding's family lived. An introductory letter had already been sent to Elder Fielding's family from Elder John Taylor in America. Elders Russell and Snyder went to Alston in Cumberland, and Elders Hyde, Fielding and Kimball were to stay in Preston and that vicinity. Right, so let's have a little look where some of these missionaries actually went. So we'll start seeing the map coming on now. So Elders Fielding and Kimball then went first of all to Clitheroe, Waddington, Chatburn, Downham, Walkerfold and Ribchester in the Ribble Valley. And they had great success, as we all know, in Chatburn and Downham, and often baptizing between 10 and 30 people after each sermon. And after a while, when not on the first occasion, but on a subsequent occasion in Chatburn, we read here, having been observed nigh to the town, the news ran from house to house, and immediately on our arrival, the noise of their looms was hushed. The people flocked to the doors to welcome us and see us pass. The youth of the place ran to meet us and took hold of our mantles and then of each other's hands. Several, having hold of hands, went before us, singing the songs of Zion, while their parents gazed upon the scene with delight and poured out their blessings upon our heads and praised the God in heaven for sending us to unfold the principles of truth, the plan of salvation to them. Right, now then we move to Alston. So elders Russell and Snyder were assigned to head north to Russell's native Alston, near the border with Scotland, where they established a small branch. John Snyder didn't stay long, but Elder Russell, he did stay quite a few weeks. And by the time he'd left, there'd been upwards of about 60 people baptized, and he left the branch in charge with his cousin Jacob Peart in April 1838. The gospel was then taken down to Bedford. So elders Richards and Goodson, they were the first to preach the gospel in the south of England. Now, the Reverend Timothy Matthews, who was also one of these relatives of Elder Fielding, he'd already received this letter explaining that about the gospel, and he was the brother-in-law to Elder Fielding. And there he had similar experiences where Timothy Matthews opened his chapel up for the preaching, but soon found out that his congregation were going away from him and going over to this new religion. And again, he wasn't happy about it. So once again, he turned his doors closed and said that the saints couldn't meet there anymore. And unfortunately, again, he also became against the church. Right, where do we go to next? Well, now this is interesting, that they went back to Liverpool. Now, you would have thought that Liverpool might have been there earlier on, being that's where they docked. But now was the time. But it wasn't that long, in all fairness. It was only just a few months. So they left on the 19th or 20th of January, we're not quite sure which, 1838, to travel to Liverpool. Now, between the elders going to Bedford and the elders going to Liverpool, Timothy Matthews had actually moved congregation. He'd been reassigned to go to Liverpool. So he became the preacher in Liverpool. And although he was against the gospel, just trying to, one of his colleagues, I can't remember, but one of his assistants allowed the members of the church, the missionaries, to preach in the chapel vestry, which they did do, and that was on the 2nd of February. Oh no, sorry, that was no. Sorry, I'll get this right in a second. On the 2nd of February, the elders held an outdoor session in Liverpool where 300 people came along. Now then, Reverend Matthews here wasn't very happy with his assistant, and he said that the missionaries couldn't go into their chapel anymore. So at least it started the preaching off there in Liverpool. Then we go to the potteries, and 21st of January, elders Woodworth and Turley, they went to the potteries, and they soon created a branch and left it in the care of Elder Alfred Corden, who was a local potter and who worked 6 days a week and then preached 5 evenings and 3 times on a Sunday. So I think that's quite some effort that he was putting in there. And this is where the elders met Wilfred Woodruff and the Benbow family in Hanley. Right. And the next step was going down to Birmingham. The church grew rapidly in Birmingham to start off with. many people started joining the church, and they purchased or leased several chapels from other denominations which were subsiding in their memberships. Now, on the 1851 census of religions, which we'll come to in a little while in a little more detail, it was showed there that there was 1,200 people in attendance at one of our church services. So that's some substantial building that they must have had for that particular service. Now then, we do have a problem that's occurring here though, and that is polygamy.
Get rid of it.
Once many people, especially non-members of the church, found out about polygamy, there was a lot of antagonism and resulting, and I'm sure you've read the stories or heard the stories of quite violent attacks and a lot of provocation going off, crowds, should we say, and mobs trying to stop our church from meeting. And unfortunately, that was one of the issues that they had a lot against. Now, that opposition was primarily led by a Reverend Brindley, but fortunately, when the Birmingham Journal found out what had been happening, they actually supported the fact that all religions have the right to worship in peace and the way that they wish, as long as within the laws. And so the Birmingham Journal was able to quieten down the mob violence that started. And also there was another vicar there, Reverend Miller, who backed up the newspapers and gave support to the fact that we should be able to worship the way that we wanted to. Now let's have a look. Herefordshire. Here we go. On the 3rd of March in 1840, Wilfred Rudrup and William Benbow, who was now travelling with Wilfred, went to see friends and family in Herefordshire, where they connected with the 600 of the United Brethren. And the first sermon that they preached to the brethren was on the 5th of March. Now, again, I'm not going to go into that story. It's a well-known story and very much left for another time. So, just a few statistics for you here. At a conference on the 14th of April 1840, again recorded 34 branches, as we mentioned before, 1,677 members, but there were 34 Melchizedek priesthood holders. This is excluding the missionaries, by the way, and 100 Aaronic priesthood holders. And here we go. Now then, Gloucestershire, Wilfred Rudrup arrived, like I say, in April 1840, and by October had baptized 160 people. And much of their teaching and preaching was focused on the members. Yeah, just excuse me. So that's it. I just had no longer enough on my phone. Sorry about that. Much of their preaching was focused with the United Brethren. And by the 14th of June 1840, we got a meeting which organised in that area another 12 branches. Now then, we have a little issue coming up, as was very much an issue for many decades in the church. But maybe it wasn't an issue for the people themselves, was emigration. And of course, we all realise that emigration, to some extent, kept the strength of the church low in England and the rest of the UK, but it gave great strength to the church in America, which is perhaps where it was needed at the time. So, as we can see, the first official emigration was the 6th of June 1840 of 41 saints. And others quickly followed, and within 12 months 1,000 people had emigrated by chartered ships. Now then, let's just move on to just bear with me a second, I'm just trying to get my facts straight here. There we go. Yep. So moving into Manchester Conference now. So there now was at this point a total of 41 branches with 2,513 members, as we can see, 56 elders, 126 priests, 61 teachers, and 13 deacons. So the church was progressing well. But then came the attempts to take the gospel into London, and elders Kimball, Smith, and Wilford Woodruff arrived on the 18th of August 1840, and the first baptism took place on the 13th of August of Henry Connor by Elder Kimball. It was slow progress, but nevertheless they did make progress. But it's interesting to see that they only baptized, sorry, and the first few baptisms that they made, there was 2 8-year-old boys. One, George Teasdale, and the other, Charles Penrose. Both of them became apostles later in life. So out of those very early converts were the 2 of the apostles there. But then we go out into the Isle of Man. On the little map, it looks like it's in the middle of the sea. I know that, but there we go. On the 18th of September, Elders Taylor, Hiram Clark, and William Mitchell started preaching there. And by Christmas Day, had baptized 40 people. So that's from September to Christmas. And including the families of the Cowley family and the Cannon family, as we know, became great leaders in the church. Just quickly, in Manchester here, on the 6th of October 1840, it was recorded that there was now 3,626 members of the church. In the London Conference, a few months later in 1841, noted that there was now branches in that vicinity included in Bedford, Ipswich, Woolwich and London, where there was 106 members in London, but by August that had risen to 200. So maybe it wasn't progressing quite as fast as in other areas, but nevertheless it was progressing. But in total, by this conference in August 41, there was nearly now 100 branches throughout the UK. The mission office in Liverpool was established. Previous to this, it was in Manchester, and that was established in 1842. And Brigham Young was now in the country. Remember, he came in 1840, and this is where the mission office was now established. And he spent most of his time around that part of the country between Manchester, Liverpool, particularly supervising the emigration. During his 22-month stay in Great Britain, missionary efforts brought between 7,000 and 8,000 new members into the church. Nottingham, moving into a slightly different part of the country. Michael's home stake, and was once upon a time my home stake before we was poached into the Sheffield stake. For those of you who don't know, I'm from Mansfield. Right, so Nottingham's first mentioned there in 1843, and they had a total of 5 members. Now, the Perpetual Education Fund was established in 1849, and again, that's a different story about the Perpetual Education Fund. But interestingly enough, those who had served honourable missions, which is not only those missionaries who had come from the United States to England, but if people had served honourable missions within the country, which many did. There was one brother, William Francis Moss from Mansfield, who served a 7-year mission, full-time mission, before emigrating. And he was married, and his family came with him on all of his different missionary exploits around the south of England where he went to. There were others who didn't use the Perpetual Education Fund, who were self-funding, and this is the example of Ishmael Scothen, who was a member again of my own ward of Mansfield. And the church historians tell us that it often took up to 10 years for a family to be able to save money to emigrate. Or if they were single, it could take them 7 years by themselves. Now, Ishmael was a coal miner in this country, and they emigrated in a way that many other families did, a bit at a time, not necessarily saving all the money and all going at once. So his first child emigrated, who was an older child by this time, in April 1881, and then more children emigrated in 1883. Later in 1883, Ishmael himself emigrated, so he could be with the family in America, and he got a job straight away over there, again in a coal mine. And so that was in August of 1883, and he was able to send the money over, and his wife and the other final two children emigrated in April 1884. But the sad part is, after he'd sent the money over, Ishmael was then killed in a mining accident, and obviously never met his wife again in this life. Now, just to give you some ideas about how the church was progressing in its membership. I hope you can see the figures. I'm not going to read them all out, but we can see in the first 4 years there was nearly 6,000 people baptized. But then in 9 years, up to 1850, then what was about just over 5 times the amount were baptized. So great progress was being made at this particular period of time. But other things were happening at this time as well. Printing, it was found that it was far cheaper to print church materials in this country rather than printing them in America and shipping them over. So we have all the various books there, the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, hymn books, tracts, Millennial Star and Pearl of Great Price, all being printed in this country. And talking about the hymn book, 94 hymns in the current church hymn book had either the words or music written by British emigrants. Although one exception to that rule, he wasn't an emigrant because he was still a resident of this country, and that is William Fowler wrote, "We thank thee, O God, for a prophet," here in his home of at Sheffield, where it was sung for the first time. Now then, that 1851 Census of Religions, a wonderful document, one that I've looked at many times over, especially for my own county of Nottinghamshire. But from going through there, people have calculated that there were 7,500 people, as we can see in the morning services, and up to 16,500 in the evening services, which was similar to other churches where they had far more in the evening services than what they did in the morning and afternoon services. But we were now up to 222 separate meeting places across the country, with the largest being in Birmingham with that 1,200 figure as mentioned previously. Now then, on this next one that I'm going to show you, because I'm not able to do these little extra bits coming in on a slide, then you're going to see something which I wanted to bring in secondly, but I'll bring it up straight away. But we're going to be talking about converts versus emigrants. So we've spoken about emigration and we've spoken about converts. So we'll read this little thing straight away. A little ditty. Perhaps she's on the railway with the bells so fair. Perhaps she's up in a balloon flying through the air. Perhaps she's dead, perhaps alive. Perhaps she's on the sea. Perhaps she's gone to Brigham Young, a Mormonite to be. And yes, let me just see if I can. I'm just going to make that very small and get that out of the way, and hopefully you can see some of the figures now. Oh, it's not liking it, is it? There we go. We'll get back. We'll get there. There we go. So what I put here are the figures of the progress of the church from 1840 to 1910. So the first figure is the number of members estimated in the church. The second figure are the number of emigrants during that decade. So we can see, in other words, from at the end of between 1840 and 1850, the figure at the end of that period was 42,000 members, but 6,000 or nearly 7,000 had emigrated. The following decade, which you'll see from the little graph on the right-hand side, was the peak of the emigration, where nearly 13,000 emigrated. And bit by bit, as we're getting more baptisms, more people are emigrating, and by the end, by 1910, there's only 8,000 people in church membership in the country. And even then, 3,600 had only recently emigrated. Right, now then, again, the bottom one should have come up later, but well, excuse me, come to that in a minute. But so we got in 1855, there were 33 conferences. Remember, each conference constituted, like a state does today, several branches. But in 1855, there was a decline, and some of the branches have been closed and members joined together for strength. And this is an interesting quote, again, from my home ward. The Mormons of Mansfield Woodhouse made a strenuous attempt to found a Worcester Mormon Society in 1848. But although the services were continued for about 7 years in a house in Marriott Yard, Buck Lane, the principles of the faithful could not take root in Worcester soil. The overflowing congregations were drawn together. And I think that that was happening all up and down the country. Many of the branches were joining together to create strength. And as I mentioned before, after that, there was no more members in Worcester for over 100 years. And the next person to be baptized in Worcester, well, in reality, was me. It was my mother and my 3 brothers, but I was the first one to actually go into the font on that evening. Right. So then, just moving on to the next one. Where are we? Now we've got a problem. Missionaries by the 1870s were diminishing, and there was only actually 12 American missionaries left in the country at this particular point. The big problem, of course, had been the civil wars in America, which had prevented the missionaries from coming to this country, and therefore the missionary work was slowing down by this point. And once again, we've got persecution raging across the land. And Elder Morris in London, he wrote that most of the shops had in their windows large placards, 18 by 24 inches, headed Mormon Devils or Latter-day Devils. So you can see that the persecution was quite intense. But Elder Talmage, as we know, was born in England, he was able to come along with his great skills of oration there to calm this persecution down, and he settled many misconceptions about the church in a lecture tour that he gave in 1891. So he did eventually manage to get a little bit of settlement there. In 1906, President Joseph F. Smith encouraged the saints to stay in Britain and to build the kingdom here. And as we know, that didn't necessarily happen. But the emigration did start to calm. Now, then comes along the First World War. So there was less full-time missionaries coming into the country, although they were not taken out altogether, not like they were during the Second World War. So there was less coming, but many locals started to be called as missionaries. So as we can see, there were 258 missionaries in 1913, but by 1919, there was only 5. So the war had certainly made a big difference. But during the war, many people in general started to turn to prayer and started to look for spiritual comfort, which started opening up the doors to these local missionaries that were being called, which were mostly the sisters. As we all know, that the brethren were being called up to the wars. So there were about 300 baptisms per year throughout the war. And there was around, the membership increased to about 8,000 with 70 branches by the end of the war. Now, here's an interesting character, James Gunn Mackay. He started his mission as a mission president in 1915. And in the 5 years that he was in London, that he was a president, so this is across the war years, the branches grew from 6 to 13 in the London area. In 1919, all the branches were in the care of the local leaders, but prior to this, many of the branches were being led by missionaries, but most missionary work, of course, was now being done by the locals and most of the sisters, as mentioned. And interesting as well, the government actually now refused to grant visas to the American missionaries, but that was retracted in mid-1920, and then more missionaries started to come over to this country once again. And by 1921, the missionary force had been built back up to where it was. There we go, picture of sister missionaries. Around this time, just after the war, it was calculated that there were around 300 sister part-time missionaries. Persecution started to come along again, and Elder Talmadge came to the rescue once again, but this time he was over here as the mission president, and he went on a lecture tour once again and managed to quell a lot of the bad publicity of the church. But at this time, chapels as well, between the wars, were starting to be purchased. This is one that was purchased in Mansfield, but this was actually after the Second World War, this particular one. But between the wars, the church were purchasing chapels. They actually had an active acquisition program. And in 1935, it was recorded that there were 12 chapels across the country. And 2 years later, they were added to by Bradford, Rochdale, Merthyr Tydfil, Liverpool, Southwest London and North London. So they were getting more and more chapels, so it was getting a firm footing. Now a few more little bits and bobs for you here. So once again, after 1932, elders from the USA were declining, leaving local members to run the branches once again. And also, but fortunately, emigration also declined, which meant that there were some good, strong brethren now coming up in the church to look after these local branches. And I just noticed in the bottom one there, 17 full-time local missionaries by 1934. Right, okay. A few little figures for you. The first 100 years of the church. So there had been, by 1937, nearly 6,000 missionaries had come into the church, including those few serving in the church in this country, including those few from England and Scotland and Wales and so on. There had been over 126,000 baptisms in total, and 52,000 had emigrated. 1935 was an interesting year. Britain itself organised an official baseball league. So, of course, the American missionaries got well into this one, although the missionaries were dwindling in numbers. They all played baseball, I'm sure. And they actually created 2 teams to go into the British Baseball League. And both teams were in the final of the first year. So one took first place and one took second place. Again, that took quelled a lot of the anti-church propaganda. Again, this next slide I'm coming up, there should have been, I'm just going to try and pull this one slide away for a second and just look at some of the other bits and bobs. A few facts and figures here, just to quickly want to go through. So in the missionaries, all in one go during the Second World War, were actually taken out of the country, and that took a lot of the strength away. So the 75 branches that were now established had reduced to just 29 branches by the end of the war. And but missionary strength soon started to return, and by 1946 there were the 43 missionaries, and the first new building to be purchased was in Nottingham, and 5 more chapels were purchased by the following year, and 26, and so on, many more figures, just to show that the church itself was now starting to take root good and solid across the country. And we go by 1950, 593 converts with 238 missionaries now in the country. And by 1951, it was called that there'd been a great awakening, which it certainly was. And more and more figures, which we can go in to a lot of detail, but we won't worry about those too much. But the one great thing that we need to talk about, of course, is the temple. And the temple was first announced in June of 1952 and dedicated in 1958. And we know that there's still many members around that were there at that dedication, and it's great to hear them saying that they were there and telling us of the stories that they had. Now, just bear with me. And now then, let's have a look. The first stake we're going to quickly come on to was organised on the 17th of March 1960 in Manchester, and at the same time the British mission was divided between the north and south of England. But we'll come back to missions in a little while. There's a little list of all the stakes that were being organised in the country. So Manchester was the first, London the second, the Leicester the third, and we're going to be using the Leicester one as a case study in just a couple of minutes. But then quickly, as we go throughout the next couple of decades, many more stakes were created across all of the United Kingdom. And just a quick peek at the missions. We've just got the British mission from 1837 right through till 1960. And then the other missions starting to come along. But the interesting thing is, look at some of the names of the mission presidents there. Brigham Young, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, Joseph Smith, Eva J. Grant, George Albert Smith, David O. McKay. 7 future presidents of the church were all mission presidents. What a great legacy that we've got here. Right, again, several things coming up at the same time here, but during David O. McKay's term of office as the president of the church, we progressed in the UK from 1 mission to 7 missions, from no stakes to 9 stakes, 100 new chapels, and membership had now risen to 70,000. And that was a 10-fold increase from 1950 to 1970. And of course, the London Temple. And in 1951, David O. McKay told us, of course, that every member should be a missionary. And that this was a new era in the British mission, and it certainly was. Just at the bottom there, we did see a temporary decrease in missionaries due to the Korean War, but it soon got back up to speed again. Right, just an update. Up to 1960 then, there had now been over 7,000 missionaries coming into the country and 138,000 baptisms. 1961 saw the dedication of the Hyde Park Chapel, one of the flagships of the church, if you like, outside of the temples. And the little chart tells us, I'm not going to go into great detail, but very quickly it tells us how many mission branches there were in the first column, apart from not the date column, of course, but the next column along, and got to a peak in 1965 that then started subsiding. And that's wonderful because they were being converted into wards and branches within stakes. So as the missions were slowly handing over to the stakes. And the total units, as we can see, 1937, 67. Now in 1985, there was 361. And the new chapels, well, 54 in 1965 and 195 by 1985. So great progress was now being made in this new awakening. 1960s, we've come of age. We've looked at all these wonderful programs coming into the church, the family home evening, the Latter-day Saints Student Association, athletics, seminary, distribution center, public relations, welfare services, and the dedicated area facility management. So things were certainly progressing well. Just very quickly, the baseball era baptisms, which we all talk about, and we saw the origins of the baseball. Those 1960 to 62. Look at the baptisms that were taking place there. And then the baptisms, accumulative baptisms with the total membership in the right-hand chart there that we can see. So from 1960 to 1965, from 19,000 to 71,000. And the Melchizedek priesthood holders were progressing at such a pace as well. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a case study about the Midlands, because we all know of the temple that's forthcoming in Birmingham. And the case study I'm going to be looking at is taken from the book written by Derek Cuthbert entitled The Second Century. Now, in here, just bear with me. Now, Derek Cuthbert, by the way, just a little bit of a background to him. Obviously, a very stalwart member of the church, but he was the first UK resident to be called as a general authority. And that was in 1970. Now, the first thing, what it tells us about is that in 1960, he was involved in discussing the creation of the Leicester district. And that was by merging the Nottingham district and Birmingham districts together. Now, this proposal was put forward and was accepted, although it was modified. It wasn't quite as big as what they'd anticipated it to be. It was slightly reduced in size. But we can see from the statistics here, so 8th of January 1961, 2,100 members, 12 branches. And this is the incredible thing, 160 Melchizedek priesthood holders with 80% of them active. Now, I wish we could have that sort of figures today. That's wonderful activity rate. Now, here comes the interesting thing. Take note of that date, 8th of January. Their motto was, don't wait for the stake, work for it. And just look at the date that the stake was created. 8 weeks. They put in so much effort, and I'm going to tell you the sort of effort that they were putting in. They visited the the district presidency, visited every branch every week, and sent out on average 5 training bulletins every week they sent out for those 8 weeks. So they visited every branch every week.
Who's the presidency?
Right, the presidency was Derek Cuthbert was called as the president. He was that's right, of the district. He was the president of the district with Oliver Storer as his first councillor and Ken Paul as the second councillor. Now then, when the district was then, for want of a better word, converted into a stake, and the new stake presidency, we have got Derek Cuthbert remained as the president. Ken Paul was a councillor, and Bill Woodward was the other councillor. So Oliver Storer wasn't brought back into the presidency, so he only served in the presidency for 2 months. But what of Oliver Storer there on the bottom left-hand corner? He became the first UK patriarch since Peter Mellin in 1840. And Michael, did he give you your patriarchal blessing?
He sure did.
And he gave me my patriarchal blessing. And you, Carol. Yes, so there we go. We've got fond memories of this brother. So, yes, he no doubt gave many, many patriarchal blessings. So it was the first one since Peter Mellin in the 1840s. Right, at the same time, we've got the Central British Mission being created. And just look at the difference between the figures from 1961 to 1969. The mission figures rose from 4,061 to 10,069. 3 districts and 1 stake to 7 districts and 2 stakes. 17 branches to 12 wards and 43 branches. Now that's growth for you, isn't it? Now then, the next slide I'm going to show you again is going to be a nice intro.
This became a ward.
Yes. Oh, yes. Right. Now, again, there's 2 things that have to come up at the same time, which shouldn't have done, but we'll go through the one in the little yellow box to start with. That's what Derek Cuthbert did. Before he became the district president, sorry, I'll get this right. He was released as the state president from the Leicester stake and later became a Birmingham state president. But between those 2, he was on the mission presidency, and he was covering 25,000 miles per year on mission business. Now you imagine the cars in those days, they weren't quite as efficient as what we've got today. So 25,000 miles a year on mission business alone. And the other image on the 4th of October 1964 at Sutton Coldfield was the first General Conference relay, which was a priesthood session into the UK. Right, so then the Birmingham State was created. Again, Derek Cuthbert, as I mentioned, became the state president of that state now, with Stanley Wood and Robert Maule. I'm sure many of you remember Robert Maule as well. Right. Now, where are we here now then? So after this is important. So the following day after that state was created by President Kimball, it wasn't the president of the church at that time, but by President Kimball, the day after, he went to the Malvern Hills for a meeting up there, and many members went with him, including Derek Cuthbert. And they took chairs up there with him to have a meeting, and it started raining. They all got wet. But this is what President Kimball said. This is the place where the blood of Israel is richly concentrated, and there are many still to gather. Further progress. 1971, we had the first area conference held in Manchester. That's the first in the world, of course, area conferences. 1977, we've got the Solihull offices being opened up, becoming quite a hub of activity down there. And of course, we were providing missionaries by this time across the world, so we was exporting missionaries. In 1985, we got our own missionary training centre, originally, of course, in London, at the London Temple, but then transferred to the Preston Temple in 1998. Which, of course, is the year when the Preston Temple was dedicated and opened up for activity, for being able to perform those wonderful ordinances. And just in our final few slides, of course, more recently, it's been announced on the 3rd of April 2022 that the Birmingham Temple is going to be built. site announced on the 18th of December 2023, which I'm sure we was all following quite enthusiastically, and then the artist impression was given for us. And if you've not looked at it on a map, if you look at this map, you'll see the Birmingham Temple is almost halfway between the Preston and London Temple. And if you didn't know as well, the planning application has been submitted. That was submitted on the 8th of March to Birmingham City Council, and it's still with them at the moment. And at the next slide, I went into the planning applications, the online planning applications at Birmingham City Council. And if anyone's wondering how they're going to fit it on site, this is what they're going to be doing. On the left, the admin buildings are going to be pulled down and pushed further backwards on the site, and the temple put where you can see it in red. So that's how they're going to be squeezing it onto the site. So just a one endowment room, one ceiling room. So yes, it'll be a mini temple, as we might say, but nevertheless, I'm sure that it's going to be very much used. But to finish off with, we're going to leave England, and we can't miss out this piece of wonderful news. But you know, Edinburgh getting their first temple. So that's going to be the 4th in the United Kingdom, and we hope that it not be long before other parts of the UK will get their temples still too. Right, so there we go. I've taken plenty of your time up, so thank you for listening.